It's been 6 months, in fact, exactly to date as I record this, it's been 6 months since India's first Chief of Defence Staff, General Bipin Rawat, unfortunately died in that helicopter crash with his wife and also many personnel of the armed forces. Now, 6 months, Government of India has not filled up that position. Now, the appointment of the CDS, the creation of the CDS's position was seen as a great new reform by Modi government. And Modi government talked about it repeatedly. And yet for 6 months, they haven't found a replacement for General Rawat. Now it's evident that government has been also having learned from their first experience, has also been fine-tuning the role or the job definition of the Chief of Defence Staff. So the latest indication of this, and that is the reason we are doing this episode of Cut the Clutter, the latest indication of this is a new notification that has come out. Or in fact, I might say 3 separate notifications have come out. One each for Army, Navy and Air Force. So I'll read the text of one for the Army, and you can just replace Army with Navy or Lieutenant General with Vice Admiral or Air Marshal, and you will get the picture. So what is the notification? The central government may, and I'm quoting, this is Government of India language, and frankly it has too many commas. If it came through our editing desk, at least half a dozen commas will go away. But Government of India writes the language as they write the language, so I can't argue with them. They get into IAS, etc., etc. People like us don't. We are not good enough, but it just has too many commas, so I will not pause at each one. It says the central government may, if it considered necessary in public interest. ये दोनों comma है. The central government may, I am honoring that comma. The central government may, comma, if it considered necessary in public interest, comma, and then it says so to do. So I don't understand why that comma is needed. So once again, if it considered necessary in public interest, so to do, comma is out. Appoint as CDS an officer who is serving as Lieutenant General or an officer who has served in the same rank, in the rank of Lieutenant General or General, but has not attained the age of 62 years on the day of his appointment. And this age limit of 62, I told you it's expanding the catchment, but it's also limiting the catchment. It also rule out all the recently retired chiefs, all the former chiefs, and particularly the recently retired chiefs, because they all retired after attaining the age of 62. So once again, don't expect the government to try and find a gender balance or to say the more modern their appointment or his/her appointment, because at least in the armed forces, that equation is quite simple. For a long time, for these positions, all likely candidates will remain to be men. Now, this notification, you can again replace Lieutenant General with Vice Admiral or Air Marshal, and in place of Army, Navy or Air Force. What this means is quite simply that now government has widened the catchment area. It's widened the catchment area. It is not bound by the protocol. In the armed forces, protocol is very important. It's not bound by the protocol of taking the senior most serving officer or senior most retiring officer. Nor does it seem so bothered anymore, or at least it's not bound anymore to pick up a CDS somebody under whom the current chiefs might necessarily have served or not served. So some of that equation has been changed right now, because this Government of India notification has quite a bit of clarity. What they are saying is that our choice of the next CDS will not be confined to one of the serving chiefs right now, because that is what had happened the last time. The last time when General Rawat was appointed, he was retiring on 31st of December 2019, right? On the 30th of December, a day before his retirement, an order was issued that he will be India's first CDS. 31st December was his due date of retirement. So he was still in service when he was appointed or promoted, you might call it, Chief of Defence Staff. Again, importantly, he was one of those rare chiefs in current times who was retiring after serving his full 3-year tenure before turning 62. So the current rule is that a chief of staff, Army, Navy, Air Force, will serve for 3 years, a 3-year tenure, or until he attains the age of 62, whichever is earlier. So General Rawat would have turned 62 on 16th of March 2020. His retirement date, that is when he completed 3 years of service, which means he had become chief really much younger than many others, was 31st December, and that's how he became CDS. So the limitation of 62 years of age on the day of the appointment was always there, but now the catchment has been widened to retired officers and also officers who might have retired or might be serving in a 3-star rank. Now you might say that, look, lieutenant generals in the army, God knows how many lieutenant generals are there. I haven't done a count, but my colleague and our defense editor, Snehesh Alex Philip, tells me that Indian Army at this point has about 90 lieutenant general ranked officers serving. 90. So 90 in service, many retired, right? And similarly, Navy and Air Force will also have officers in that rank. So has the catchment become that wide? No. That's where the 62-year thing comes in. First of all, the 62-year thing says that of the retirees, which means anybody who retired 5 years back. Usually, people who become, say, C&Cs, Commanders-in-Chief, that in the case of Indian Army, Navy, Air Force, will be an Army commander, that is GOC, Northern Command, Eastern Command, Western Command, Training Command, Southwestern Command, etc. And similarly for Navy and Air Force. For Navy, these will be senior vice admirals. For the Army, these will be senior lieutenant generals. For the Air Force, it will be senior air marshals. Now, this is not written in the notification, but it's understood and it's quite clear that this field will not be open to anybody who attained that rank. This field will only be available to those who've served as commanders-in-chief, so as army commanders or Air Force commanders, say in the eastern sector, western sector, or the vice admirals in charge of the various commands of the Indian Navy. So this is limited to commanders-in-chief. Again, there lies a nuance. Commanders-in-chief in the Indian Armed Forces retire after attaining the age of 60. So first of all, anybody who retired more than, say, 2 years ago is out of the reckoning. So they should give up hope. Even among those who might have retired within the previous 2 years, now it will depend on when this appointment is made. Because on the day the appointment is made, that officer should not have crossed the age of 62. So the longer the government takes making this appointment, the more people might find that they are falling out of the reckoning. So obviously, government is widening its reach. At the same time, it's putting some pretty strong and pretty clear limitations as to who would be eligible for this job. Now, with this, there are also going to be changes with the job definition. And if you frankly want to understand it better, all you have to do is read Snehesh's stories, because he's been ahead on this story for a long time. In fact, even the day after that unfortunate crash, he had done a story that government is now might be widening its net and looking at officers beyond the serving chief, so beyond the outgoing chief. So in fact, he broke that story within a day, just a day after that tragedy. So he's been front-running on this story, not front-running in the way that some mutual fund managers do and get themselves and their fund houses into trouble with SEBI, not like that. But front-running on the story means beating everybody on the story. So since then, he has also done a couple more stories also. I'm sharing all 4 with you, where he said the government's now also having second thoughts on how is the job defined. Because, Modi government's way sometimes is it's a decisive government that when they decide something, they don't do all the homework and staff work, which frankly somebody might say is too much bureaucracy, then you will never take a decision. Americans call it analysis paralysis. At the same time, you have to look at scenarios. So when they made this appointment, maybe they missed out on some scenarios. Now, in the armed forces, protocol is very important. Protocol is important in most places in the government. Check out the judiciary, protocol is very important. But in the armed forces in particular, hierarchy, protocol are very important. Now, what happened with the CDS's job as it existed or as it was defined under General Rawat was the chief of defense staff was the first among the equals among the chiefs. So there were three chiefs and chief of defense staff. They designed a different kind of uniform for him. They designed different kind of epaulets and pips for him. But he was one of the four-star officers in the armed forces. But for all practical purposes, first among the equals, because he had now become the permanent chairman of the Chief of Staff's Committee. So Indian Armed Forces have a Chief of Staff's Committee, three chiefs. They take turns in terms of their seniority on who becomes the chairman of the Chief of Staff's Committee. So at any given point of time, the senior most of the three chiefs becomes the chairman of Chiefs of Staff Committee. For example, General Narawane, who just recently retired, he was the chief, and as he retired, the Air Chief Marshal B.R. Chaudhary, because he became the senior most, he became the chairman. And this sort of indirectly or serendipitously works as a system of rotation. So just to give you an example of how this works, General Bipin Rawat was the 26th Chief of Army Staff in India. So he was the 57th chairman of the Chiefs of Staff's Committee. This CDS now became the permanent chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. So that rotation business then ended. This is where we get into trouble. The Chief of Army, Navy, Air Force in India, the chief in protocol is ahead of secretaries to the government of India. When you say secretaries to the government of India, it also includes the defense secretary to the government of India. In fact, defense ministry has not one secretary, but has a bunch of secretaries. It has a secretary defense production, secretary DRDO, secretary ex-servicemen's welfare. So the chief in any case today is above these secretaries in protocol. When CDS office was designed under General Rawat, it was said that he will also be the Secretary of Department of Military Affairs. So a DMA or Department of Military Affairs was set up and he was to be secretary. Now this became a very funny situation where the three chiefs are above the secretary in protocol, where the Chief of Defense Staff actually is the chairman, permanent chairman of Chiefs of Staff Committee, but in a second job which he performs simultaneously, he's at the same level as secretaries in the ministry who he would have outranked even before his elevation. Now that was a sore point with the armed forces. So that is another reason, and also it was felt that the secretarial work, not secretarial work as in typing and taking dictations, but the work of the Secretary of the Department of Military Affairs was so much paperwork and so much file work that this was weighing down the CDS in his other roles. So that is the reason government has been thinking about splitting the jobs. And if the jobs are split, then what will happen is that the new CDS position will be CDS and will be above the secretary rank, the same rank as other chiefs, but the job of Secretary DMA will go to another officer, a Lieutenant General, Senior Lieutenant General ranked officer, who reports to the new CDS. The new CDS means the new position of the CDS. And who this officer might be, who might function as Secretary, Department of Military Affairs, he may be something which is described as CISC. Now, armed forces, we know, run on acronyms or abbreviations, right? All armed forces anywhere in the world. I think the Americans are the most colorful with these, but even in India. So in fact, even while go through this discussion, just as part of decluttering itself, remember the few abbreviations that will keep coming back at us. So CDS, all of you know about, that is Chief of Defense Staff, DMA, Department of Military Affairs, then COSC, that is Chairman, Chiefs of Staff Committee, then CISC, and that is the important one. Now, CISC is actually the Chief of Integrated Defense Staff. Integrated Defense Staff services all three forces, Army, Navy, Air Force. And there's a senior Lieutenant General rank, Lieutenant General, Air Marshal, Vice Admiral, who heads this department. Now, that officer is called CISC. So the first question that came to my mind was, if he is Chief of Integrated Defense Staff, why is he not called CIDS? CIDS, why is he called CISC, right? Sarkar mein, now there must be some reason why the government created this complicated thing. Why CIDS, CISE? So I figured out with the help of Snehesh, CISE actually is, and this is a mouthful, right? Only Government of India and only the armed forces. Combination together can produce such a marvel. It says Chief of Integrated Defense Staff to Chairman Chiefs of Staff Committee. What that means is, if I break it down, that Integrated Defense Staff actually services the Chairman of Chiefs of Staff Committee. So this is the chief of that committee. So this officer likely, if the position of DMA is split, will become Secretary DMA reporting to CDS, so that CDS will not be equivalent to secretary anymore, but will actually have a secretary reporting to him. So that will also answer one of the big concerns that the armed forces have always had, which is who comes ahead in hierarchy. Is it the civilians, or is it the so-called quote unquote, I'm sorry, not my words, but it's an expression you hear often, particularly from the veterans community. Is it the bloody bureaucrats, quote unquote, who come ahead? Or is it us generals, us soldiers who come ahead? So this problem is being sorted out. This is a serious issue in not just in inter-services relations, but also interprofessional relations. Because we talk about jointmanship. So jointmanship is not just between the three armed forces or leaders of the three armed forces, but also the civilian leadership, because Indian armed forces are under civilian control. So that jointmanship is also very important. India did very well in the wars of 71, 65, because the defense secretary at that point and the chiefs worked together very closely with a great deal of trust. So that's also important. So in the past also, in an episode of Clutter, we've talked about the duties or the role of the Department of Military Affairs. I'm not repeating all that. As I'm speaking, you will see that list on my screen, and we let it freeze for some time as I talk, so you can read it, and if you want, you can take a screenshot. It's useful. Similarly, there is also a list of duties or responsibilities of the CDS. Mind you, all these are in the original notifications, right? Now some of these might change. It's most likely that some of these will change. So do check these out, and you can see that this is quite comprehensive, and for one man to do all this was onerous, and that's now being corrected or rectified to the extent that the government might be able to do it in the second round. And frankly, as we go ahead, we will find this role evolving again and again. So here is my limited understanding or interpretation of this change which has taken place. What will be the consequences? Number one, CDS won't be senior to the current service chiefs, right? So CDS will be at the same level as it was said originally. CDS will have no operational role. So service chiefs will not be reporting to the CDS for any operational clearances or operational role. So this CDS, given the age limit of 62 and the rank, etc., will not be senior to the current guys. Now, it is possible that if one of the current guys becomes CDS, he might be notionally senior to the other two. For example, if today the current air chief were to become the CDS, he will be notionally senior to the other two, but that's only notional. That's one. Number two, CDS won't be first among the equals. In this equation, and that's my understanding, I might be wrong, but I think it's a reasonable presumption to make. In this new formula, new system, CDS won't be first among the equals, he'll be one of the four. Number three, CDS won't be a secretary equivalent in the government of India. So that answers one grievance. He might in fact have a secretary level officer, secretary level serving armed forces officer, uniformed officer reporting to him. In fact, in May last year, and Snehesh had done that story also, May last year, Government of India had given civilian ranks to many serving officers. So some of the lieutenant general rank or equivalent had become additional secretaries, some of major general rank and equivalent had become joint secretaries. So that will continue, and similarly, there might be a secretary who's a uniformed officer. Number four, the idea that CDS's job, at least for now, is non-operational, will be institutionalized. It was said earlier, but it will now be institutionalized. So those are my interpretations. I can't be sure about any of this, but these are my interpretations as to who the next CDS could be. Again, you are going into area of speculation. With Modi government, you know that nobody knows until you see the announcement in a notification. But people will come and people will go in a position, new people will come in, but it is the position and how it's defined and how its role is redefined over time that matters. That is the reason it was important for us to discuss this today.